Hello, my name is Jim Turk, and I'm the director of the Center for Free Expression at Ryerson University. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I'm speaking to you today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I acknowledge also that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississaugas and Credit bands. On behalf of the Center for Free Expression at Ryerson University and our co-hosts and co-sponsors today, the Edmonton Public Library, the Milton Public Library, the Thunder Bay Public Library, the Toronto Public Library, and the Vancouver Public Library, I want to welcome you to the sixth in the Center for Free Expression's In Conversation series, featuring prominent guests discussing issues of importance in the current political moment, in which democracy is under threat, public discourse on vital matters is fragmented into self-affirming ideological bubbles when not discouraged altogether, and censorship is increasingly seen as an ally rather than an impediment to social justice. Our conversation today is with Loretta Ross. Loretta is a truly remarkable person. I first learned about her when I saw an op-ed she wrote in the New York Times in 2019 titled, "I'm a Black feminist. I think call-out culture is toxic. There are better ways of doing social justice work." Subsequently, there was a New York Times story about Loretta titled, "What if instead of calling people out, we called them in?" As I looked into who Loretta Ross was, I learned of her long career as a progressive social justice activist that started in the 1970s, working in and directing the United States' first rape crisis center, which was located in Washington, D.C., and then heading up the Women of Color programs for the National Organization of Women, serving as program director for the National Black Women's Health Project, and program research director at the Center for Democratic Renewal National Anti-Klan National Anti-Klan Network, where she worked with the Reverend C.T. Vivian, one of Martin Luther King's close friends and comrades. She also founded and was the executive director of the National Center for Human Rights Education and co-founder of SisterSong, Women of Color Reproductive Justice Coalition. Loretta decided to retire as an organizer in 2012 to teach about activism, and is now visiting associate professor at Smith College, where she teaches a course on white supremacy, human rights, and calling in the calling out culture. She is also an author and prominent American public intellectual. It's both a pleasure and an honor to have you with us today, Loretta.
Thank you for inviting me.
The title for today's discussion is Transforming Call-Out Culture. We are delighted that Loretta will be in conversation with Asam Ahmad. Asam is a Toronto-based writer and community scholar. His writing and pedagogy facilitate difficult and complicated conversations, help people to speak to and find each other, and originate pathways for progressives to move forward with a sense of shared responsibility and kinship. His first book of essays on identity and social justice is forthcoming from Between the Lines Press. Welcome, Asam.
Thank you, Jim.
In terms of today's program, after about 45 to 50 minutes of conversation with Loretta, Asam will turn to the audience to bring you into the discussion. As you listen to the conversation, if at any point you think of a question you'd like to ask, please go down to the bottom of your screen where you see the Q&A button and click on it and just write out your question. You don't have to wait till they turn to the audience to do that. The chat feature on this version of Zoom is not connected, so you have to ask your questions through the Q&A button at the bottom center of your screen. So write it down as you think of it as the conversation goes along. And then after 45 or 50 minutes or so, Asam will turn to the audience and bring you into the conversation. Right now, it's time to hear from Loretta and Asam, and over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Welcome, everyone, and hello, Loretta. It's so good to see you and talk to you today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great for an old lady, having a ball.
How's the weather there?
72 degrees, so I shouldn't brag.
Wow. We're actually having an unseasonably warm day, so the snow is melting today, which feels really good. Looking
Mm.
forward to going for a walk after this. Um, I guess I wanted to start just by mentioning the serendipitous timing of this event because pretty much the same time last year, we were doing an event together in Massachusetts. I think it was February 22nd. uh,
Right.
and that was also on, transforming call out culture. So here we are, 1 year later, full circle. Time seems to have kind of stood still, but also I know for you, things are really, really moving forward, and you're doing so many of these talks and dialogues. So I guess I wanted to start with just given how much work you've done over the years and um, how much history there is that you come with and knowledge that you've acquired. Let's just sort of contextualize this conversation because I think so often when we talk about things like call out culture or something that seems like a new problem, there's actually like a very real history behind it. And there's often like people who've done the work around like similar issues. So for instance, I was looking at doing my own research, and in 1976, Miss Magazine published an article called The Dark Side of Sisterhood. And that article was basically describing a phenomenon called trashing. And I'm going to quote here. It's that they say the writer writes, "What is trashing? This colloquial term that expresses so much yet explains so little. It is not disagreement. It is not conflict. It is not opposition. Trashing is a particularly vicious form of character assassination, which amounts to psychological rape. It is manipulative, dishonest, and excessive. It is occasionally disguised by the rhetoric of honest conflict or covered up by denying that any disapproval exists at all. But it is not done to expose disagreements or resolve differences. It is done to disparage and destroy." So that article from 1976, there's a note that Miss Magazine has appended to it that says that that article received more responses than anything else they had published up till then. So I think I just wanted to put that out there as a starting point for us because I think it's really important to remember that while the internet has really exacerbated and intensified these conversations, there's nothing new about this, right? This has been going on for a long time.
Well, Joe Freeman, who wrote that article, who's now known as Joreen, is a friend of mine. We
Right.
were both budding feminists in Washington, D.C. together. And of course, we understood that there was a lot of disparaging in the women's movement, but also we have to remember a larger context. This was the time when COINTELPRO, the FBI's counterintelligence program, was very active in trying to discredit all of our human rights movement, whether it was the American Indian movement or the Black liberation movement, the women's movement, the gay movement, the anti-war movement. All of these movements were being infiltrated, and they would use the tactics of gossip and bad mouthing and sectarianship and all of these things as a way to splinter these movements. And so when someone did this particular form of trashing back then, we didn't know if they were politically disagreeing with us, just being disagreeable, or whether they were a provocateur or a plant. We couldn't figure it out. So we ended up basically distrusting anybody who caused more disruption within our work than unity. And I would bring that forward today when people are so much self-indulging into this call-out culture. Well, when you encounter an old hand like me, I'm going to wonder not if you're naive or that you're trying to be politically pure, but are you do have another agenda there? Are you actually trying to be disruptive and stuff? So it may not be achieving the goals that you think it's going to achieve when you spend all your time pointing out everybody else's mistakes except your own.
Right. And I think that, it makes it really, really difficult because I think so often people hold on to conflicts or disagreements or just even gossip and rumor and innuendo to disparage other people who might be doing similar work, who might be movement builders and activists. And so in that context, how do you actually figure out who's on your side, which conflict is legitimate, how to sort of navigate, you know, different kinds of personalities and disagreements and conflicts in that context.
Well, one of the things that I promote is that instead of trying to form all of these great relationships before you do the work, you'll actually find out who are you working with in the crucible of the struggle. So, because everybody can be nice to each other and kind to each other when you got these guidelines and ground rules and don't yuck my yum and all of that. But when you're actually dealing with the work, when you're actually dealing with taking on the state, like you need to go down there and negotiate a parade permit so you could have a demonstration, or you need to go demand some freedom of information documents from a state agency, or you just have to provide guidance for someone so that they can navigate home safely or deal with the fact that their children may be separated from their families. When you have to deal with these real life issues, that's when you find out who you're really working with. Because some people will stand up to the pressure, some people will run from it, and some people just want to melt back into their lives and not feel afraid anymore, which is an understandable feeling. But that's when you really find out who you're working with. So I think you develop the strongest political relationships by doing the work rather than presume that you have to have the relationship before you do the work.
Right. And today, when there is, you know, again, a fascist uprising, global fascist uprising, and white supremacists in the streets, what do you see as the harms of call out culture, and how do you see it playing out now as opposed to even like a couple of years ago, before Donald Trump, post Donald Trump, and how that conversation has shifted, do you think?
Well, the right wing has tried to seize on the concept of the call out or the cancel culture to act like they're the real victims of it. I call it falling into that proto fascist script of seeing themselves as victimized so that they can deliver extreme harm to other people because they're really good at that, imagining an enemy and then going around and annihilating that enemy. This is what they do. This is how they manipulate people's fears. And so, for example, they are so busy trying to cancel people themselves, of course, and as well as, I mean, they're the originators of the call out culture. Where do you think the word puritanical comes from? Where did the Salem witch hunts come from? Where was McCarthyism comes from?
Right.
But they're cynically trying to use the concept of call outs and cancellations to say that they're the victims now of all of this political correctness run amok, and they don't know what to do, and they can't say what they want to say without fear of being canceled and all of that. But that's just working in bad faith. They're not honest. As a matter of fact, I thought it was humorous that at the Conservative Political Action Committee conference, that that's called America Canceled,
Yeah.
ended up canceling a black speaker or a black rapper, I think, because they didn't like what he said. I was like, well, wait a moment. You have no sense of irony that you're having a whole conference on the cancel culture and yet you cancel somebody because
Yeah.
you didn't like what they said? How interesting.
Yeah, what's hilarious about that is that they didn't use the word canceled in that post. They literally just said he will not be making an appearance. And just to clarify, this person said something really anti-Semitic, but in the context of CPAC, which is hosting all sorts of right-wing, um,
Anti-Semitic people. I
yeah,
mean, we are talking about the people who have yet to scrape the neo-Nazis and the far right out of their ranks.
right,
And so, and they've invited Donald Trump to give a keynote. I
right,
mean, these are not the people who should be talking about canceling. His every tweet was a cancel of somebody. And so Their
Right.
hypocrisy and their bad faith is so obvious. And the way that they're trying to wrap themselves in this mantle of victimhood to perpetuate this white male grievance stuff, that they're the ones that all this multiculturalism and all this critical race theory is trying to erase or cancel, is a bit much. When in fact, every time they have power, they abuse it and they punch down on very vulnerable people. And they're really complaining about the cancel culture because we're punching up for a change. That
Right.
anybody with a keyboard can call them out and hold them accountable, and they don't like that.
Right. So one pushback that I've received in this work is people saying that anytime you criticize call out culture, you are doing the work of the right wing because you're sort of uh, giving power to people who say that people who have historically been wronged or marginalized don't have a right to speak back. And my response always is like, when I talk about call out culture, I'm talking about a very specific mainstream practice that often comes from very, very privileged folks who are, sometimes just learning new concepts and feeling like they need to really sort of be really mean and cruel to people who might not get those concepts, or also maybe have certain kinds of new language around things, and then really aggressively sort of dictating how people can use certain words. So that's very different. But I wonder if, like, you do think there's some truth to this saying, because the right wing has taken up this mantle, and now the shift from calling out to cancel culture. How do you see that differently? And do you think there is a difference between those two things?
Well, I don't have a lot of problems distinguishing between who I'm going to call in and call out because everybody makes mistakes. I mean, nobody's perfect. And so if you make a mistake and you have a chance to do better, but instead you deny the harm that you've done, and in fact you double down on your mistake, then I'm going to call you out.
Right.
But if you make a mistake and you show that you want to do better and you're capable of being accountable for the harm that you did, then I'm going to call you in. So it's not about expecting perfect people or people not to slip up or use the wrong word or the wrong gender pronoun. I'm not expecting that of people. I'm expecting them to be adults and making sure that they understand that words can wound and you need to be accountable for the words you have, because it's not necessarily free speech so much as consequence free speech that some people want to demand. They want the right to say whatever hurtful, harmful thing they can say and act like they can just run behind the banner, the protective banner of free speech, and ignore that the harm that they're causing. Because words do wound, and words create worlds, as some writer said. And so we really need to understand that we're not talking about a kumbaya festival where the victims of oppression no longer can speak up against that oppression. It is our human right to speak up against oppression, particularly people who are intentionally causing that harm. But at the same time, I'm writing my book criticizing the call out culture mainly because we indulge in too much horizontal hostility, hostility against people with the same level of power, sometimes shared identities. I mean, there's nothing worse than watching a group of people who should be getting along turning into their own circular firing squad so that the opponents don't have to do anything, just let you self-destruct as you debate whether or not, if you're working on women's rights and you're not working on environmental justice, and you're not working on queer rights and you're not working on indigenous rights, well, all of y'all must be doing something wrong because I've got the answer kind of stuff. um, that weakens us in the face of this global fascist movement. And so that's who I'm actually speaking to as my audience. How can we as a human rights movement work better together so we can take on the neo-fascist movement? So I'm not at all confused.
Right.
Who I'm calling out, and I think it's the weapon that the human rights movement has always used to
Right.
bring shame to people who are capable of feeling shame. But we've noticed that, with the Republicans that we have here down in the States, they're not even capable of feeling shame.
Right.
So calling them out probably still isn't the greatest weapon we need to use. I want to strip them of their power.
Right. I think it's good to spend some time on this because a lot of people I think are confused. And I really like when you say, we're building a movement, not a cult. And so often it's like disagreements or uses around language, or even like questions around like dogma, like what is political strategy moving forward, or like which identity can speak on certain things. Um, People feel like those disagreements means you can't work together. And I feel like that's a real problem, right? Because we really have to think about who the enemy is. And if you feel like um, there are people out there who are actively vested in your destruction, call those people out, right? Like that makes so much sense. But with people you want to build with, people you want to actually have relationships with, and that's how I define calling in, is that you call in people who you want to build with, who you actually want to keep getting to know. I'm not gonna have a private conversation with the young fellow from CPAC, like I'm not interested in that. um, and I like
But
Mary Kaba's phrase too, which is like you meet people where they're at and you work in the ways that you can, and you take it from there.
well, see, part of the problem I think that's driving the call out culture is people are wrapping themselves in their victimhood claims.
Mm.
Like, I have had this trauma, I've had this horrible thing happen to me, so I have the right to say to anybody anything I need to because it's going to alleviate my pain. It's going to make me feel safe. It's going to do a whole lot of other things. And I really want to question the weaponization of victimhood status because that to me is inappropriate use. Matter of fact, I want to know how well walking around with that victimhood mantle and that permanent grudge works for you. I mean, why are you letting this whoever harmed you leave their dirty fingerprints all over your life so that you're constantly walking with this other person in your heart? How well does that work for you? Like they say on the internet, who hurt you? To make you want to be that way. And
Right.
so I think that we're dealing with an overstatement of harm. I find that people are manipulating people. They seek to defame people in order to become famous themselves. I think that there's a lot of abuse of the call out culture that's happening on what's called the left. And that's what I'm concerned about. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen on the right, but I could give a, rabbit's foot about the right. I really am concerned about how it's working within that human rights movement that I'm a part of. And so Sarah Schulman wrote a wonderful book, All Conflict is Not Abuse. And we need to understand that we can have principled debates with each other without descending into the call out culture and not practicing identity essentialism by saying, well, I have this identity, so I know more than you do, and I can say this and you can't, and all of that. That to me is where we weaponize our pain instead of healing from it. And I find that people are really attached to being in pain if that's the only identity they found for themselves is as somebody's victim.
I think times often people are also attached to the pain because it's something that gives them power. It gives them a kind of legibility to speak. And it also gives them a kind of authority, right? Because then you can say, well, I'm this identity, I have this experience, and you don't get to tell me what that's like, right?
Well, I don't know. A victim identity, by definition, is a disempowered identity. I mean, you can't maintain your victimhood and then say that gives me power. That doesn't work in my linear brain. Now, if you say I'm going to be a survivor, and this is what I've learned as a survivor, how to overcome the oppression that's been my way, how to deal with those people who want to re-traumatize me, how to deal with that, that's a different thing. But when you're walking around with a short fuse, looking for the very next thing that can re-victimize you so that you can claim that you have some experiential authority, uh,
Right.
it really makes me again ask that question: how well is that working for you? Because you're going to be in a permanent state of rage at everybody. You're a fight looking for a place to happen. That has to be a miserable way to be in the world.
I definitely agree with you, but I think what I mean by like power is that there's a kind of currency, right, that you get within liberal discourse to be able to speak on certain things. And I think people value that in a lot of ways. And especially if you have been traumatized and oppressed, you know, in so many different ways in society, it can feel sort of good to be able to hold on to that, to say, well, this gives me this kind of legitimacy that you don't have.
Well, see, I don't know if I want to play competitive victimhood with somebody. And I try to tell people, you don't even want to start with me. I'm a rape and incest survivor. I had to co-parent with my rapist for 47 years. I mean, let's start talking horror stories. But I don't need to go down that dark hole with you in order to claim my power. And I hope that I can help you come out of your own dark hole and find another way to be empowered, because that's not necessary. And I still question, because I really want to have strong compassion for people like that. How well is that working for you
Right,
when your only claim of identity is what somebody else has done to you?
right,
That means that you're permanently in the thrall of that person who's capable of hurting you, or that system that's capable of hurting you. Now, I'm not talking about, you know, pretending that white supremacy doesn't exist, that neoliberal capitalism doesn't exist. There are a lot of structural things that we as human rights people need to fight. But at the same time, you get to decide how you're going to be in that fight. And are you going to be one of those people who uses the struggle as your personal therapy space instead of its real purpose, which is to end all forms of oppression?
right. So if someone, say, who's listening in this audience is dealing with a situation where they might be being called out in a scenario similar to this, where someone is weaponizing their victimhood status, overstating harm, things like that, what would you say is the most appropriate way to respond to that or to interact with that?
Well, I always want to go underneath the outer behaviors. I want to go underneath the words. I want to go underneath the behaviors. So instead of reacting to what they're doing or saying, I'll put my reactions in a parking lot somewhere and then just say, okay, I hear you. I respect you, but what's really going on with you? You know, what's underneath this pain that you're just flinging around on everybody? I want to know that, and I want to give loving attention and respect to that, because everybody wants to be heard, everybody wants to be respected, everybody wants to be liked or loved. So I'm willing to make that offer to people and give people the benefit of the doubt. Now, I have no control over whether or not they're in a position to accept it, though, because a lot of times you offer people grace and forgiveness and a loving ear, and they don't, they rebuff you. So, because I wasn't given that magical superpower to control other people, darn it. So I have to, make the offer and give them that loving attention, but also know when I need to walk away. Because some people you need to work with, and some people you just got to work around. And if they double down and insist that they have the right because of what's happened to them to cause however much harm they want to do, kind of like it's getting revenge for who harmed them, then I'm going to figure out another strategy. But at first, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. Because what I find in most people is that they have this great interior opinion of themselves that doesn't match their outer behaviors or words.
Right.
And so instead of focusing on what they're doing wrong, that's so dissonant from what they are inside, I want to focus on what's inside. Let's build that inside muscle up, that good person inside up, so that then you can address the cognitive dissonance between what you feel about yourself inside and how you're behaving and what words you're using, and not just consider that a different way. Or you can put them on full blast and just pay attention to what they do and what they say. But I don't think that gets us far, because then you just end up in name calling.
Right. I think publicly, responding sometimes puts you at a disadvantage, because then it's like you're just adding fuel to their complaint.
Oh, yeah. Well, like I said, if a person is determined to fight and be miserable, there ain't a whole lot you can do for them. Except, like I said, ask them, who hurt you? And they just keep on walking. But I don't think that unless you have a particularly masochistic bone inside of you, personality, that people like feeling miserable, that people want to hurt people. I don't think that that's the majority of people. I just want to be able to say I have a larger toolkit. So I always have call out as an option, but before I choose that as the first weapon, why don't I try something else? Like listening to them with patience, like trying to help them see what they can do better and how they can make themselves happier, and why walking around in this bubbling cauldron of rage is causing them to sabotage their own joy. Helping them, because you're supposed to have fun fighting oppression. I think it's a friend of mine who was one of my mentors when I first started doing anti-fascist work. He told me to lighten up, Leonard Zeskin. He said, lighten up. He said, fighting Nazis should be fun. It's being a Nazi that sucks. And so if you're not having fun fighting oppression, you're doing something wrong. Now, certainly being oppressed is not good, but fighting it should bring you joy.
I always think that phrase, I forget who wrote it, but the responsibility of the artist is to make revolution irresistible.
Tony Cade said that,
And I
yes.
think so often that we don't make revolution irresistible. We make it a headache, right?
Why would anybody want to come hang out with Debbie Downers? I am not going to a party that makes me feel worse than I felt before I walked in the door.
Right.
That ain't here. That's just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And so if we don't make the revolution irresistible, if we don't show how much joy you can get out of doing the right thing, how much self-fulfillment and how much growth you can get. But it is kind of like riding getting on that exercise treadmill, because at first it's gonna hurt, when you start doing that first half mile, and it's gonna hurt, but then that half mile gets easier and on and on. And then you find the joy of finally being able to kick that treadmill's butt. So I can't say it's always going to not hurt, because you can't fight oppression without going through pain. But being in pain is not the purpose. Finding joy out of doing the right thing is the purpose.
Right.
And so it's not always easy, but I think we do not understand that we have privileges to fight oppression too. I mean, this conversation you and I are having would be banned in many countries, and people would be assassinated, kidnapped, or simply imprisoned
Right.
for having the same kind of conversation that we're having. So one of the things that I think we don't do enough of in the global north is protest our privileges. We're really good at talking about our pains, but we don't protest the privileges that we have. Uh, Matter of fact, I went on a rant yesterday. I did a total call out on somebody yesterday because I was on like maybe my third or fourth Zoom call of the day, and all of a sudden, this so-called radical activist started complaining about their Zoom fatigue, and they were so tired of staring at screens and blah, blah, blah. And I happen to know that this person with their radical analysis is earning a check every time they stare at this screen.
Right.
I'm like, wait a moment, wait a moment. You're not out there cleaning people's butts at the hospital, delivering the packages or your food, picking up the garbage. You're not out there even exposed to COVID. You're in the comfort of your living room earning money, and you're complaining about Zoom fatigue. I mean, try cleaning bathrooms for a living. try doing 100 other tasks that people who are considered essential workers can't avoid,
Yeah.
and yet your biggest complaint is Zoom fatigue. See, that's what I call the failure to protest our privileges.
Right.
We really aren't accountable for this stuff that
Right.
we have. And I understand it's hard, and be isolated from your friends and your family and stuff. But I think there's a lot of people who aren't isolated from other people who wish they had our isolation, but they have no choice but to get out there
Yeah,
amongst the people and do their jobs and serve them as best that they can. And they're the ones disproportionately dying from COVID.
definitely. Or these morning walks, I see buses full of essential workers going to work every morning, right? And it's just a real emphasis that we are not all in the same pandemic. We're not having the same experiences in this pandemic.
So I did my own call out yesterday
That's
because
great.
I was just upset that people were feeling so sorry for themselves from the comfort of their living rooms or
Right.
bedrooms or wherever. The fact that they have living rooms and bedrooms
Yeah,
needs to be noted.
for sure. Toronto has a huge housing crisis right now, and the city is actually suing an individual who decided to build tiny homes, tiny shelters for the homeless.
They're suing someone for providing housing.
They are. Yeah.
How did our values get so inverted?
Yeah. So one thing I wanted to go back to is you bringing up fighting fascism earlier, and I know I've heard you speak um, working with the Klan or working against the Klan to organize and movement build. And so I guess I wanted to ask you if you want to spend some time talking about working with people across difference. Because I think, forget the Klan, people don't even want to work with like people who have slight disagreements in the same sort of sector, doing the same work. You'll have someone, I think a lot of it is also dogma. People think, well, this is anti-oppression. There's no other way to be anti-oppressive. If you are doing it any other way, we can't build together. So I guess I wanted to hear more from you about like what does it mean? What can we work with together, and what is like what you can't? And if you wanted to share some experiences from your own work.
Well, I have a taxonomy that I use. Um, I use this chart of influence, and if you give me a minute, I'll talk about it.
Sure.
I think that most of us participating in this call are what I call our 90 percenters. Not that we're 90% of the population, but we have a high level of agreement with each other. That's why I call us the 90 percenters, because we got the same buzzwords, the same lexicon, capitalism, fascism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, et cetera, et cetera. We know all the words to describe what's wrong with the world. Our call out problem at the 90% level is that we're trying to turn 90 percenters into 100 percenters. So, like I said, we're not a cult. You'd have to have cloning to have people 100 percenters.
Right.
And we spend entirely too much time saying, well, if you don't have this analysis versus this analysis, if you don't use this word, if you don't see this the same way I do, you're doing something wrong. I think that that's a mistake, and I try to steer us away from those practices. But outside of us 90 percenters, there are 75 percenters. These are the people who share a worldview with us to an extent, but they don't like all that in group language that sounds elite to them. And that is very group specific. And so for me as a feminist, for example, the Girl Scouts would be my 75 percenter.
Right.
They're not going to organize troops to go do clinic defense at an abortion clinic like I wish they would. But at the same time, they're going to talk about girls and women's empowerment. So that means that they're my ally. The worst they could be is a problematic ally, but generally they're just going to be my ally. And then outside of them are the 50 percenters. These are the people like my parents. Because my father was very conservative, a Jamaican immigrant in the military, so he was hyper patriotic. I mean, Uncle Sam let him come here in 1924 and work 3 jobs to support 8 kids. I mean, you couldn't criticize America in the eyes of my dad and stuff. And my mother was a conservative Southern Christian woman from Texas. And so dad joined the National Rifle Association and mama went to church all the time. But I call them 50 percenters because depending on who influenced them, they could go from the right or the left. And so one time my mother and I were talking, and she was trying to explain to a neighbor what kind of work I did. She said, "Well, I've got a son who's a pharmacist, and I've got another son who's an architect, and Loretta just doesn't go to jail too often." So she can figure out that if you're a social justice activist, you must be getting arrested all the time. Frankly, I've never been arrested, but that's what mom thought. Anyway, I said, "Well, Mom, wait a moment. Do you remember when you started that Girl Scout troop for Black girls because we weren't allowed to be in the white one?" Of course, you remember that. And I said, "Do you also remember how you used to make us every weekend cook food to feed the homeless people?" She remembered that. I said, "Well, Mom, you feed the hungry. As a human rights activist, I asked why they're hungry in the first place." What I did was speak to her values. She had the right values, even if she landed on a different strategy for addressing those values. And that's about the extent to which I'm going to organize people at the 50% level. Outside of them, there's the 25 percenters. Those are the people who think freedom is the freedom not to wear a COVID mask, where I think freedom, it means not being around your contagious butt. And so we have vastly different definitions of freedom. And those are the people I'm more likely to call out, but I'm still going to give them the benefit of the doubt before I choose that as my first weapon. And then outside of the 25 percenters are what I call the 0 percenters. Those are the people who are white and proud, fascist and proud, racist and proud, xenophobic, transphobic, and proud of it. And those are the people that I'm probably most likely going to call out. And so when it comes to an organizing strategy, I'm going to work with the 50s, the 75, and the 90s, and then have the 90s influence the 75s and the 75 influence the 50s.
Right.
It's possible that the 50s can influence the 25s, and it's possible that the 25s can influence the zeros. But what's happened in the last 60 years is that that trend has gone the wrong way. So you end up with the zeros, the people on the far right marching into the halls of Republican public policy. So that the ideas are going from the right and capturing the 50s, capturing the 25, and then trying to eliminate the 90s. And we need to be more strategic than that. I hope I didn't just totally confuse things.
No, that makes sense. And I think so often the need to be harder to people who you're trying to build with, I think it really comes so much from your own history of trauma. And also the fact that you have access to someone to yell at, right? Like you don't have access to Nazis because we don't actually want to be in the same space as them. But when you're sharing space with someone, they're right there. You can just yell at them, right?
Well, I learned as a feminist that one of the first steps of empowerment, and you see this in babies as well as adult people, the first thing they do is say no to the person who's taking care of them, to the person who's doing their best to help them. It's just one of the first steps of empowerment. And what happens is people sometimes get stuck there
Right.
because they feel the power of being able to say no to someone who's trying to help them. And they get stuck there. It's an arrested development stage.
Right. So I know you've said that there will be all these other steps you want to take first before you call someone out, and that there's also very few people you'd actually call that you're working with because that's reserved more for people who want to destroy us. But I've also heard you say that you do believe in cancellation.
Oh, yeah.
So what does it mean to cancel someone, and what would it take for you, for instance, to call someone out publicly and say, okay, this person I can no longer work with?
Well, I just wrote an article a couple of weeks ago that's called The Nacification of the Republican Party.
Right.
Because in that article, I argued that they've had 60 years to scrape out the Nazis within their rank, to scrape out the white supremacists within their rank, the people who came in through the White Citizens Council and supported Jim Crow segregation and supported gay hate crimes and all. They've had a long time to be accountable and get rid of those people. And the fact that they intentionally choose not to means that they don't mind hanging out with Nazis and rapists and racists and all of that kind of stuff. And so I said, until they scrape them off and make sure that these are not the people contaminating the identity of the Republican Party, I don't see them as a legitimate political party because they've been too Nazified. They would rather overthrow a democracy than share it. That's called fascism. There's no other way to call that. And so I have no problem calling those people out because you don't debate with eliminationists. All they're trying to do is eliminate you, not debate with you. That just, there's no purchase there to have a civil discussion with them.
Right.
And so I got a lot of hate mail because I said that the Republican Party had been Nazified. But I also said it in reflection on what had happened in Germany. Because in 1923, Hitler led an insurrection against the German government. And he was sentenced to prison for 5 years, I believe. But he was let out after serving less than a year. And within 10 years, he had overthrown the German government.
Yeah.
So if you give too much leniency to these people at the wrong time, you're going to find yourself with a more competent fascist than Trump was.
Yeah.
And there's a whole lot of more competent ones waiting in the wings to see how much they can get away with. And so I demand that the Republican Party be accountable for coddling these white supremacists, for giving cover to these insurrectionists. And I see them in Congress, whether it's Hawley or Cruz or Lindsey Graham. I see them in the US Congress as much as I see them in the street. And so I am going to call them out. I'm very clear that they have no intention of living in a pluralistic democratic society if that means they have to share power with people who they're having trouble acknowledging the humanity, much less the votes of Black people.
Well, what's really is it's not even 60 years, but even after what happened on January 6th.
You need to get closer because I can barely hear you.
Sorry about that. I think what's interesting is even after 60 years and after what happened on January 6th, they still refuse. There are Congress people who refuse to stop supporting the insurrectionists, and apparently the party doesn't seem to care that much about it.
That's where the politics of fear come in. Because, I mean, I live here in Georgia where death threats were made against election officials for trying to maintain the integrity of the vote. And those were fellow Republicans they were threatening.
Right.
I mean, and so
Right.
I think that fascists believe that their only language is violence, and they're going to use that language because that's who they are.
Right.
They don't use it because of who we are or what we do. And that's a lesson we need to learn. I don't think the people of Germany who turned a blind eye when their Jewish neighbors were dragged out had a blueprint, had evidence of history. But we do. We know that history now. So we need to make sure that we're not the ordinary Germans standing aside while our democracy gets overthrown.
Definitely. I think that's a good point to actually sort of start wrapping up this conversation. And I wanted to ask you specifically, since this is the Center for Freedom of an Expression, how do you see the role of freedom of speech in relation to other freedoms, especially given fascism and the fact that we have the model of history where a lot of liberals, for instance, in German Nazi, insisted on giving platforms and debating Nazis instead of shutting them down. How do you feel about that? And I want to contextualize that by saying, because there are a lot of liberals and there are a lot of folks who believe that, people like Charles Murray, who wrote The Bell Curve, people like David Frum, or people like Steve Bannon deserve to have their ideas platformed and shared. And I think in this context, in this historical moment where we're at, I find that extraordinarily alarming. And I think only those who are safe from fascism and its practices can think that there's any benefit to debating fascism. But I do want to get your opinion, because that's where I feel I stand.
Well, first of all, I have to go to history I mean, I think that people like Karl Popper, who said in 1945 something like too much tolerance of intolerance will mean there's be no more tolerance pretty soon. And he was warning that made that warning right after World War II. I think that there's always a debate between those people who want to speak truth and those people who want to speak lies masquerading as truth.
Right.
And so when Charles Murray wants to talk about uh, the differences between the races of people in terms of intelligence, I call him a liar. And I can't understand why anybody who wants to use that term race realist would entertain that unless they secretly agree with that kind of bad racial pseudoscience.
Right.
Um, People are abusing the free speech principles in bad faith. And we need to be sophisticated enough to understand that and not platform them so that, as if we're talking about two two sides of the same coin. That would be like, okay, I'm going to give a platform to someone who thinks that the election was stolen at the same time someone believes that the election was not stolen. I
Right.
mean, I wouldn't invite someone who doesn't believe in gravity to teach in my physics department. I mean, you don't bring Holocaust deniers to say it didn't happen
Yeah.
and think that you're going to have a false equivalent debate between them and someone who's a survivor of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
Somehow they only somehow get confused when it comes to racism, though, and homophobia and transphobia.
Yeah.
Like, okay, I can understand the physics example, but I don't understand why we can't debate whether racism is good or bad. I
Whether
mean, what are you
measuring
talking
people's
about?
skulls is still legitimate science.
Exactly, exactly, because there's a long history of
Yeah.
legitimating racialized science in our
Yeah.
society. And so,
Yeah, and I think, you mentioned earlier too, we have an extraordinary privilege just having this dialogue because we don't have government censorship in Canada, in America, at least to the same extent that there might be in other countries. And so free speech really, like especially in Europe, free speech is so much about freedom from the state. And in North America, it seems to be about freedom to just say anything. And it doesn't matter how offensive it might be, how violent the rhetoric might be, how much violence it might create for other folks. There seems to be this idea that that platform still should exist for those folks.
well, we put limits on it though, because like they famously say, you can't holler fire in a theater. You can't
Right.
threaten the president or a cop. I mean, there's some things you can't do, or you will quickly find yourself in deep doo because of it. And so we do limit those things that we want to do. And that's why I think there's fake helplessness when it comes to holding the purveyors of racism, white supremacy, and fascism accountable. It's a fake helplessness because we have the tools, we have the knowledge, and we understand that they are perpetrating lies that do damage to society writ large, democracy writ large, but also to individuals, particularly if you're an institution of higher learning. In my opinion, your job is to create the best learning environment for students, not pretend that you're the government, like you've got to provide this false equivalence between truth and lies and call that education.
Right. Yeah, I definitely agree. And I appreciate you so much for sharing. And I think this conversation, obviously, we could keep going, but it's about 4:54, so I want to be mindful of time and bring in Angie to see if there are any questions you wanted to ask.
Yeah, so there's a few questions. I just want to remind people, if you do have questions, the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, you can use that to ask questions to Loretta and Asam. The first question is, how do we differentiate conflict and abuse? Frequently, I see people using conflict to initiate callouts, canceling, but calling it abuse. How do we navigate this?
Well, I think that Catherine Cross writes excellent work. You remember her, Awesome,
Yeah.
on doing better threat assessments, because every debate is not abuse. Every time you're made uncomfortable is not abuse. Every time someone disagrees with you, it's not abuse. And so when you have this simplified formula in your head that you must perfectly agree with me for me not to feel abused, then you need some therapy, because we live in, we're supposed to disagree with each other. That's what being in a free and democratic society looks like. And if you're so sensitive that someone saying, I don't agree with you, feels like abuse to you, that's when I think you need some help. But maybe I'm just being a little too hard nosed. But Catherine also talks about some words being spear point words, like you know by their very use that someone is teeing you up for harm, like the N word or something like that, or the F word, and those kinds of things. But I think we just do very poor threat assessments, that because someone discomforts us, that we think that we are going to get or are being abused by them. And that's not how the world works. That's not how, uh, especially building movement works. And so I'm pretty hard nosed about it, I have to honestly say, because I like debates as long as they don't get personal. So I'm always going to debate ideas, but I'm not going to debate people's characters unless they show me who they are, like Maya says, then I will leave them. But for the most part, I can say that something you said is racist without then turning around and saying, that makes you a racist. You know, I'm not going to essentialize a mistake and attach it permanently to your character unless you give me more evidence that that is who you are.
I think there's also this sense of abuser just as a word doing so much thinking on people's behalf. You say, you call someone an abuser, or you just say the word, this person is abusive. And you don't need to think, what does that mean? It just means they're a bad person, and that's it. Right. And I think as an abolitionist, as someone who believes in transformative justice, it's really, really important to not go around and just call people abusers without actually really thinking about the harm that that overstatement of harm does to other people in our communities and our movements. Angie, is there another question?
The next one, the person says, I agree fully with your comments about the left harming itself. Can you say more about horizontal call out culture and what we can do? How do we get past our differences and hear each other so we can move forward?
In my trainings, I talk about some steps that we can actually take. For me, my first step is to stop and take a deep breath before I say anything. And while I'm taking that breath, I'm doing an internal temperature check, an internal assessment to see if I'm in the emotional space and have the emotional stamina to do anything about what happened. There's calling in and calling out is actually on a continuum, because you can call somebody out and jump down their throats and, you know, publicly shame them or all that. But there's an intermediate step called calling on. Sonia Renee Taylor talks about this in a very lovely way, where you're not making an investment into the person, but you're just calling on them to be a better person. And my favorite calling on phrase is, I beg your pardon. And I just let that sit there. I haven't called them out. I haven't called them in, but I've given them a chance to review in their own heads what they said or did. And then, of course, there's calling on. I mean, calling in. And calling in is when you do make an emotional investment in somebody, where you can just say to them, you know, when you use that word, I'm not sure it landed the way you meant it to. Do you mind if we go out and have coffee and talk about this? Or you can put them on public blast and raise your voice and call them a bunch of names and all that stuff. So it's not about evading accountability, but the first step is making sure you're in the space to do it. You need to figure out what you're trying to achieve by doing it. Are you willing to let go if they're not responsive to it? Are you the right messenger for doing it? Maybe someone else could be heard better by them than you are. The right, if you're not the right messenger. And then you have to be able to define what change you want them to do. Because there ain't nothing worse than asking somebody to do something and you haven't specified what it is you want them to do. And so there are specific steps to learning calling in techniques. And we teach those all the time. And they're basic common sense stuff. Just let go of your own short fuse, first of all. But I do want to say very specifically that there's no obligation to help somebody else grow. It's not a rule, it's a choice. Uh, Sometimes you're not in an emotional space where you want to give anybody your attention. You want to see to your own healing, your own growth. You just want to keep walking down the street without paying attention to the microaggression they did to you. So it has to be voluntary to do calling in or calling on. It's not an obligation because you're not put on this earth to help somebody else grow unless they're your child. Uh, and so I also tried to use this wonderful metaphor from the book called This Bridge Called My Back from Sherry Moraga and Gloria Anzaldúa. And in it, they were in 1981, they were talking about the difficulty of being a woman of color, where you had to serve as a bridge between your community of color and the women's movement. And what they described is that being an intentional bridge is the most invisibilizing thing in the world because people using you to cross over to other understandings aren't paying attention to anything but two things: where they're coming from and where they're going. What they're not noticing is the bridge that they're walking across. And so that's what I consider calling in. You have chosen to be an invisible bridge for somebody else to cross over to get somewhere else. And so if you're in a position or a state where your wounds are still gaping open, then you're not actually ready to be a bridge. And it's okay not to be ready to be that bridge. Because if you still need attention drawn to the way you're hurting, then you're not in a calling in space. And just accept that. There's many different roles you can play. Everybody doesn't have to do calling in. You can be a witness, you can be a healer, you can be a survivor, you may even be the abuser, you can be the truth teller. There's all kinds of roles you can play within this culture. You don't have to play the calling in role, but it has to be by choice because you're choosing to invisibilize your own needs.
Just building on that question, what if someone that you share community with, like say it's in the same organization or work or what have you, who is calling you out or refusing to sort of understand, move past a conflict and just using that conflict as weaponizing it? How would you navigate that? Or like if someone is experienced that, how would you recommend them navigating that?
Well, it depends on how much of an investment you want to make into the relationship with this person. Sometimes that happens between families and you don't get to choose another family member. Sometimes it happens between husbands and wives or, partners. And so it depends on how much you're invested in the relationship will determine what's your best approach, what's your strategy. I know that I tend to invest more into people that I want to keep in my life than I do with strangers, even though it's harder sometimes to work with family and friends than it would be with a stranger. If I think they're worth it, then I'm going to invest in them and be prepared. Maybe the first time you say it, they won't hear it. Maybe the third time you say it, they won't hear it. But eventually, if you give them enough loving attention, I'm convinced that something will seep through, unless they are totally and unalterably committed to being an asshole. Now, if that's where they're coming from, there's not a whole lot you can do about that because they're getting something out of being a jerk. But for the most part, most people don't want to walk around hurting other people, even if they're hurting themselves. But they think that that's the way towards healing, and it's not. Because the other thing is that when you do the call out culture, you actually decrease the likelihood of accountability rather than increase it. Because why would anybody run and tell you that they messed something up if you're going to jump down their throat for it? And so what does that lead to? People hiding, people fronting, people pretending that it didn't happen or denying that the harm happened, that kind of thing. And so with the person with whom you have a close relationship with, I guess you'd be really thoughtful about, first of all, putting your stuff in the parking lot, because as long as you don't put your stuff in the parking lot, then y'all gonna be in conflict. But if you put your stuff in the parking lot and then give them the loving close attention, that you really increase the chance that they will have that internal epiphany themselves, because you can't change them from the outside, but they can change themselves.
That's great. Angie, you want to the next question?
Yeah, the next question, how can understanding intersectionality assist us to call in and move away from just calling out?
I'm sorry, I didn't even understand that question. Could you read it again?
How can understanding intersectionality assist us to call in and move away from just calling out?
Understanding intersectionality is very important, because I think a lot of people have flattened intersectionality into a statement of identities, not a statement of vulnerabilities. And so they think that they can just layer on all of these different identities, and that somehow makes them, first of all, better than anybody else. Like I said, those victim mantles that we layer on top of each other, or have more authenticity than someone else, or somehow they think it works for them. But the Black feminist theory of intersectionality is about explaining what you're vulnerable to, what type of oppression that you are vulnerable to based on your standpoint. And Kimberly Crenshaw, who created the term, usually uses the idea of a intersecting streets to describe intersectionality. And it's because Black women stand at the street of gender, and at the same time, they stand at the street of race. And it's because we stand at that intersection, we can be hit by a car going in it on either axis. And so I think people have mistaken intersectionality as simply a statement of identity, not a statement of what could harm you and what your vulnerabilities are. And that's where they go wrong. And so, but I also say that knowing your own vulnerabilities makes you less likely to want to hurt somebody else. I find that my lived experience as being a victim of both gender-based crimes as well as hate crimes makes me do everything in my power not to make anybody else feel as bad as I felt. And so, but that requires understanding my own wounds and not weaponizing them against other people.
I think a lot of times also how I understand intersectionality is it reminds us to be mindful of people's histories, right? That people identity is tied to history and it's not a static thing. So just because you have this identity today and that there's a history of oppression attached to it doesn't mean it's necessarily only going to be oppression, and that there are other ways of navigating and moving through the world. But it does, I think, remind us to be mindful of those histories. And so, for instance, when someone is calling you out or when there's a conflict and there is an imbalance of power and there's someone who's more vulnerable to violence, um, I think being mindful of that history means that we do take their testimony more seriously. And I think that's partly why we are in so many difficulties, is because good people, people who we want to build with, recognize that yes, some voices do deserve to have this legitimacy, but I think then there is that issue of like people weaponizing that and using that for ill, and that's really the difficulty of parsing through, right?
Well, I've seen too much in our movement of people weaponizing their identities. I really do think that we need to call that stuff out, because my pain is not yours to be pimped. I just can't. And I've just seen too many people, particularly in the Black community, where they do not serve Black people in any way, but they want their Blackness to serve them to access power, influence, money, or anything like that. And so they're willing to pimp my people's pain without serving the people. And I'm going to be very critical of that. And any other identity claim that is used for selfish reasons other than service to the people who are supposedly sharing your identity.
Right. And another question.
Yeah, the next question is, I've come to believe that calling out of celebrity representatives of wrong views, talking here about the 90%ers and the 75%ers, creates a matrix of suspicion and distrust or even despair at the possibilities for making progress. Outside of direct working relationships in the sphere of media and social media, do you have a sense of this? And how would you urge people to communicate their concerns publicly?
Did the question start with celebrities?
Yes. Calling out of celebrity representatives of wrong views.
Well, see, the problem that I have with the whole calling out of celebrities is that there's too many people trying to get famous by defaming somebody more famous. And so I'm always going to see that with a grain of salt, because we're in this, influencer culture where you're trying to get enough clicks and you're trying to get enough retweets and all this other stuff. And so there's that. Also, it depends on what they're famous for. I mean, I don't go to Beyonce because she had the word feminist on her stage act for an understanding of intersectionality. I go to Bell Hooks for that. I expect Beyonce to sing and dance and have a pretty body. I do not expect her to give me an analysis of heteropatriarchy. And so we expect too much of celebrities who spent their lifetimes becoming a celebrity, not actually understanding and studying the stuff that we take for granted. So it's kind of like, why would I go to a hamburger joint and expect great seafood? You be realistic about your expectations. It's a bit childish to expect just because someone is famous that they know what they're talking about outside of their field.
I want to sort of take that question further, because I think there's a thing around celebrities, just larger celebrities, but then also even people within the movement. So people who are like elders who have histories of building will get called out. So for instance, an example I can give is Arundhati Roy, the writer who won the Booker Prize and then went on to write all of these really radical and important essays, political essays. And she's been called out for her writing around trans stuff and around anti-Blackness and around untouchables and Dalit people in India. But it's a very complicated conversation. It's not something I'm going to break down right now. But when I'm bringing it up because people often have this sort of judgment that you either, if you support this person, you hate Black people, you hate Dalits, you hate untouchables, you hate trans people. So the only way for you to not do those things is to never support Arundhati Roy or talk about her. And I find this just absolutely ridiculous and really stupid, because I think people who have been in the movement and who have been doing this work, there are other avenues of having dialogue with them. There are other ways of connecting with them, as opposed to just saying very publicly, this person is bad, and that's a full stop. That's it. And so we don't owe them anything. And I know that you've also experienced being called out. I've experienced being called out. And it's a really constant problem. And so how do we build those connections, and how do we not just shame people publicly, especially people who might seem too big, but who still might be vulnerable to all kinds of things, right? Like Arundhati Roy is vulnerable to straight repression every day of her life. And so what does it mean when we just say, well, this person is too big of a celebrity, so they don't deserve any kind of empathy or consideration?
Well, one of the things that I had to have pointed out to me because I'm an elder, that I used to walk around believing that I couldn't lead if I showed my pain, because I would be seen as weak, and that I wouldn't have the confidence of my staff if I showed how scared I was, worrying about payroll or worrying about the government coming after us and those kinds of things. And it took someone younger than me who pointed out to me that no, a leadership is supposed to be about showing your scars as well as your successes. You can't let someone discount your pain and your vulnerabilities simply because you have that title of leader kind of thing. And so it's really important for us to understand that other people, regardless of how famous they are, they're just as complicated as we are. They just specialize in doing something else different than what we do. They either worked all their lives to become a great ballet dancer or athlete or actor or writer, but that doesn't mean that they're not as complicated as we are. And so I generally don't like people trying to become famous on the back of somebody else's fame, because that's what I see those kind of call outs doing. You're just trying to call attention to yourself because you haven't contributed a whole lot to the world that even measures up to what this person you're calling out has done, right? And so it's a cheap way to try to get clicks. And instead of thinking worse of the person getting called out, I think worse of the person doing the calling out, because I think that that they have underdeveloped analyses of what's really going on, and I wouldn't trust them at my back, because the thing is, if that is their only weapon, then they're going to call me out the minute I stop pleasing them too. So I wouldn't want to be in any work with you, because you're shooting both ways while we're in the foxhole. I wouldn't want that, and so it's very hard to get people to stop doom scrolling and reacting with that quick twitch of outrage to everything that they think they have the right to call somebody out on. I remember last year, I think it was last year, God, 2020 was such a year. I signed on a letter from Harper's Magazine saying that the cancel culture, the call out culture had gone too far. Next thing I knew, instead of hate mail from the right, I got hate mail from the left, which is you gotta be doing something right when both of them are sending you hate mail, right? But it was from the left because of the signatories, the other signatories on the letter. And so one person wrote and told me that I was coddling the sensibilities of white men on the Upper East Side of New York who had too much privilege and all this. I'm not from New York, I'm from Texas. I don't even know what the Upper East Side of New York represents. And I wasn't put on this earth to coddle privileged white men. But I did have a point to say about how we go too far with this call out cancel culture, both on the right and the left. And then one letter just amused me to no end because they accused me of having the same points of view as J.K. Rowling, the Harry Potter writer. And I'm like, well, J.K. probably doesn't know me, and I sure enough don't know her except through her books. But thank you for putting me in the same company with her. But why? Well, apparently she said some transphobic things, and people thought that by her name being on the letter, that must make me a transphobe too, kind of thing. And I'm tired of these childish analyses really as political thought.
Guilt
by association, right?
So do you feel like that there was good responses to that, or it was all just people being upset?
No, I got good responses as well. But you could always tell when you struck a nerve with somebody, because all of a sudden your inbox gets filled with a whole lot of people just wanting to act out their feelings and call attention to themselves by this acting out of their feelings. And I just feel sorry for them. I keep want to say, get a life, please get a life. But there was just so much vitriol over that Harper's letter. It was hard to believe. And then they also show how unknowledgeable they are about the whole process of a signatory letter. Because you don't get to see and vet the other signatures. You agree with or disagree with the content of the letter itself.
Yeah.
So you're not going to know what company you're in until the thing's been published. And that's the way that process goes.
Yeah.
And so they revealed an astonishing lack of knowledge about how signatory letters even work.
Right. So we have about 8 minutes. I just want to check in with Angie to see how many questions we have to get through. So no, I just
Yeah, we have a few more. We might not get through all of them, but I can move on to the next one. The next one is somebody asked, what are some detoxification methods that can be used to help purify this call-out culture that's found in our communities?
I think the best astringent to call out culture is radical love. The more you fill yourself with radical love, the more you can offer it to people. As somebody said the other day, giving somebody a casual compliment costs you nothing, as opposed to jumping down their throat. If somebody says something that makes you want to pause, you can say, I appreciate the courage you had to say that. I don't agree with it, but I appreciate your courage. There's so many things you can do to show that you actually have love and respect for humanity rather than you're a walking time bomb waiting to jump down people's throats. So those would be some of the things I say.
I think to be stringent too is just to show radical love is to really be mindful of who you want to build with, right? Given what's very crisis we are facing on all kinds of levels, do you want to hold on to this conflict with this person? Is this the most important thing? And I think so often it's also about recognizing, you know, is this actually harmful to me, or am I simply exaggerating because it's easier for me to hold on to the harm? I think sometimes even the conversations around boundaries can feel more like rigidity as opposed to safety, right? People say, well, this person I can't even have a conversation with. And I think one way to practice radical love is to really think about who you can have a direct conversation with, right? Like so often these conflicts are just playing out with different members of the same cohort. And it's like, if you guys just talked, this would just end, you know? Angie?
Yeah, the next question, somebody asks, I imagine you've gotten many hate messages and death threats by speaking out the truth. How do you protect yourself emotionally, physically, and spiritually and keep on walking the path towards justice?
Well, because I've been doing this work for a long, long time, I've seen a lot of harm happen to people who do this work. And every time I witness that, I have to redecide whether I'm going to recommit to the work or not. When I was 27 years old, a woman that I was working with named Yolanda Ward was assassinated. And we were just doing work to end gentrification. And it was actually some early prison abolition work we were doing. And she was only 22 and I was 27. And we were part of a group called the Citywide Housing Coalition. We had just passed DC's first rent control bill. And once they killed Yolanda, it broke up our whole organization because a lot of people just melted back into their lives. They didn't want to continue to do this activism work. And we were caught ill prepared because everything we were doing was totally legal. I mean, we were petitioning City Hall, for God's sake. We weren't getting weapons together. We weren't breaking any laws. The worst thing we ever did was have a demonstration for rent control. So we didn't think that we would be subjected to the violence that resistance did. And it surprised us. So at 27, I had to recommit to staying in the movement, whether I was going to continue to do this work or not. And that was hard. It was scary. Then in 1995, when the Oklahoma City bombing happened, I was very visible in the media talking about how I knew it was white supremacists long before they arrested Timothy McVeigh. And somehow somebody from the Texas militia got my parents' unlisted telephone number and called them and invited my mother to a meeting of the Texas militia so that she could prove, so they could prove to her that they weren't a racist organization, like I had said on TV. And so that should be up, because my parents hadn't signed up for doing this work. That this was way before Google and stuff. We're talking about, 1995, I think it was, when the Oklahoma City bombing happened. And so that made me wonder whether I could recommit at that time. And then, I should add, my picture was in a Klan newspaper at one time too. So you have these moments where you really have to examine safety and what's going to happen to people in your life, in your family, around you, and all of that. And I don't fault anybody from stepping away or stepping back, because that they're making the best decision that they can make for themselves. But I can't say that I'm not concerned about the death threats, but I can't let them stop me.
Thank you so much. Angie, one last question, maybe?
Okay. If I see the next question, if I see my cherished colleague calling out when calling in might be more effective, how can I intervene in the moment in public without shaming my colleague?
Well, you can actually do it publicly or privately. I think that you could intervene and say, well, wait a moment, things got a little tense right now. Can we go back up and see when things kind of went off the rails, when things got a little tense, when people started shutting down and kind of thing. So you're not deliberately calling the person out, but you're paying attention to the atmosphere in which the conflict is taking place. And you have to use those kinds of strategies to see if they will work. Because if the person is determined to have a fight, they're going to have a fight. But generally speaking, most people stumble into fights. And sometimes taking a time out to pay attention, to do a temperature check of the conversation, helps to redirect it in a different way.
Great. I think we'll wrap it there. Angie?
Oh, sorry, one more question? Or next one is, how should a democratic society set the limits as to what expression should be permitted, even if troubling, and what should be outlawed?
There's no absolute rule that you can make in a democratic society, because so many words are contextual and situational. I mean, the private words that I use in the Black community maybe probably shouldn't be used in the white community. Same way that the private words that I hear my Jewish friends use to speak about each other shouldn't be used in a Gentile community. And so I don't think you can create a one size fits all kind of set of rules that really regulate words. But I'm going to take refuge in what Ta-Nehisi Coates asked. He says, not that you want to use the word, I'm going to ask, why would you want to do that? Why, how is that word working for you so that you want to cause that kind of harm? And that's the kind of measurements that we should use, rather than, I think, try to create some kind of artificial guide books or rules that don't take into account age, context, community, and a whole lot of other things that matter.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I will pass it off to Jim now. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Jim?
Well, I want to thank you, Asam, and you, Loretta. This was quite a moving, I thought, insightful and informative discussion and conversation. Will be of enormous use to many of us as we come to grips or try to come to grips with all these problems of moving forward in a progressive way. I also would like to thank the audience for having joined us today. I hope they found it as wonderful a discussion and conversation as I did. The recording of this conversation will be posted on our center's website, likely tomorrow afternoon. And if you have friends or colleagues or people in your network who you think might enjoy it, you can send them a link to that. Our website is cfe.org/center www.ryerson.ca. We also, they don't know it yet, but I'm going to ask Loretta and Asam if there's any things they'd recommend for people who want to read a little bit more about this that we'll post along with the podcast for further information or for reading about this, some resources that you could choose. So that will hopefully be up in a few days as well. Our next—
Can I say one thing?
Surely.
I forgot to tell people that I'm starting my next online class called White Supremacy in the Age of Trump tonight at 7 o'clock, and they can find out information about that on my website, lorettajross.com, in case they want to join us.
LorettaJross.com, and the class is starting tonight?
Yeah, yes, four consecutive Wednesdays I'm teaching about white supremacy and calling in culture.
Wonderful. I'm glad you shared that. And we'll put that up on the link on our site. So even if they miss tonight's session, they'll be able to catch the next.
They can join at any time.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Our next event is going to be a week today, on March 3rd at 4 p.m. And it's titled Comedy, Free Expression, and Social Justice. And it's going to feature the award-winning Canadian comedian Charlie Demers in conversation with Toronto writer and broadcaster and author Tara Henley. So if you want more information about that event and other upcoming events and podcasts of our past events, please go to cfe.ryerson.ca. And again, thank you all for joining us today. Goodbye.
Thanks for having us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.